Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Sophia Arend, and I'm a senior analyst at the Global Blockchain Business Council. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Global Blockchain Business Council and Global Digital Finance's Global Leaders Series. This is a weekly global town hall with policymakers and business leaders aimed at hearing their insights into their work, the state of blockchain and digital asset industry, and current global affairs. Today, we have the pleasure to be joined by Sheila Warren, Head of Blockchain and Data Policy and member of the Executive Committee at the World Economic Forum, and Sandra Rowe, GBBC's CEO and GDF board director, for a conversation and live audience Q&A on the current global situation, WEF's recently launched Principles for a Decentralized Future called the Presidio Principles, the role of technology in creating more secure and equitable societies, and how we can rebuild trust in institutions. So by way of brief introduction, Sheila began her career as a Wall Street attorney before turning to philanthropy and nonprofit tech over a decade ago. Prior to joining the World Economic Forum, she designed and launched NGO Source, a service focused on international grant making, and was vice president of strategic alliances and general counsel for TechSoup, the global social enterprise that has connected civil society organizations around the world with over 9 billion in donated tech resources. So a wealth of experiences there to share with us today. We welcome your questions at any point during today's webinar and kindly ask that you submit them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Without further ado, I'd like to hand things off to Sandra. Thank you.
Thanks, Sophia, and welcome everyone. I'm delighted that we get to spend some time with Sheila Warren today, one of my favorite people and leaders in the world. We have a lot to talk about, and so we're going to dive right in. Sheila, let's talk a little bit about you and how you got on the journey into the tech sector from being a lawyer on Wall Street to where you are now. We'd love to just have the audience learn a little bit more about who you are before we start really diving into some of the other issues and topics.
Sure, yeah. So, where to begin? I started my career on Wall Street, as you just heard, and I was doing M&A, working for big hedge funds and banks and whatnot. And then I left that world. I left New York. I moved out to the Valley to really focus on innovative philanthropy. And so at that time, West Coast philanthropy was really exploring different ways to bring kind of tech models into giving and what it might look like to be a little more creative about that. So I got really involved with that. A lot of my clients were kind of early innovators in that space. From there, I got really interested in the movement of money, charitable money across borders. Really hard to do, as it turns out, right? Unsurprised, as we all know, right? As we now know. And so I launched a service designed to help streamline the diligence with that. So that SaaS product launched, and then I became general counsel of where it was incubated, which was TechSoup. And that's where I got really interested in blockchain. I actually come at it from a security and data side. We worked with civil society organizations in 200 countries. I'm currently on the board of TechSoup still, so I remain involved with their incredible mission. And our CTO and I got really concerned about hacks and security on the data of these organizations. And someone mentioned to me at a dinner, hey, what about a blockchain? What if you put all that on a blockchain? And I kind of, that was my rabbit hole moment. I caught the bug right there.
Amazing. And now you're at WEF, the World Economic Forum.
Yep.
Tell us a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit about WEF's journey in blockchain and sort of, how did it start? What are you looking at? What are your objectives? Let us share with us whatever you can.
Sure. So WEF was founded, the forum was founded 50 years ago. And we had our 50th Davos this past year, as many of you know, and I know we were there. So it was kind of quite the interesting moment. And about 5 years ago, Professor Schwab, Klaus Schwab, the founder of the forum, who's in our Geneva headquarters, really started focusing on technology and how technology and technological innovation, particularly in emerging technologies, blockchain being one of them, but AI, IoT, drones, et cetera, how these technologies were really going to come together to initiate a massive transformation in society. And so he named this the Fourth Industrial Revolution, along the lines of the massive transformations we saw with things like the steam engine, et cetera.
Right.
So he wrote this book on that. He opened a center in San Francisco focused on these technologies in 2017. And I came on board as the first hire, basically, to help build out the blockchain area within that whole movement. And I have colleagues who run our AI division, our IoT division. I also head up our data policy division. And what we really do is explore the connection among these technologies and how together they are already leading to transformation in society.
That's great. And can you tell us a little bit more about the fourth industrial revolution? Because it's not just San Francisco, is it?
Correct. That's right. That's right. So we've now built out a global network. So we had offices in India and Japan and China that opened up pretty early on, almost in parallel with San Francisco. We, of course, work out of our Geneva and New York offices as well with great regularity. And we have systems there that are thinking about the future of work, the future of energy, the future of mobility, like all these different kinds of things to which there is a technical component. Clearly, technology is going to drive in a lot of these areas. And some of the concerns people are expressing are around automation, are around, you know, what it would mean to actually have a much more technologically oriented society, both the good and bad of that. And so now we have an affiliate network that spans 9 different countries, and we're expanding, you know, almost monthly. So I currently work with our affiliates, there's many of them, but I work in Rwanda and Israel, South Africa, Colombia, Brazil, you know, just a lot of these different countries, Norway, who are focused on particular, I would say that they're kind of focused on particular use cases, whether it's how ag is going to be affected or how health, you know, healthy living and healthcare are going to be affected, future of climate and oceans, things like this.
Right.
Lots of areas of intersection and focus.
Great. And when you think about sort of the roadmap, even as late as Davos 50th year anniversary versus the roadmap today because of COVID, what things have you guys had to kind of grapple with and pivot or even adjust based on what we're going through right now?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would be remiss if we just focused on the pandemic and not really what's happening in the country right now. And I'm speaking, of course, of the United States at this moment. You know, I think that we are paying obviously a lot of attention to this. You know, with COVID, just to start there, we actually launched a COVID action platform that brought together businesses from all over the world to think about how to coordinate a response. So that was in conjunction with the World Health Organization and a number of other major players, Wellcome Trust. Initially, it was really about channeling funding, you know, collectively and thinking about what might provide immediate support. My team actually rolled out a blockchain for supply chain toolkit recently, coincidentally, of course, timed with this, that really focused on how this technology might have created a better world and easier solutions for pivoting and being flexible and agile in supply chains and problems like that. So there's a lot of work happening out of the forum around supporting that, but also forward thinking to how we might create a better world going forward. And technology is a core component of that, and blockchain technology is a really core component of that. In response to what's happening now, and sort of the immediate last week, I mean, it's where to start. You know, I think that the acknowledgement that we all have is that none of this happens by accident. You know, systems are developed deliberately. They are developed whether maliciously or intentionally or inadvertently, they have biases embedded in them. And this is something that we try to surface a lot through the work that we do out of our center and out of the forum as well. We have a movement we launched we've been talking about it for a very long time, for over a decade, but we kind of crystallized it in Davos called stakeholder capitalism. And it's really encouraging companies to move away from this extractive shareholder model to thinking about the various players along the way, thinking about your employees as stakeholders, thinking about your producers as stakeholders, and what would actually look like to have a better economic model that acknowledged and accommodated and more equitably allocated resources, risks, and rewards at all those different points across a production or supply chain, you know, and to the delivery. So all these things I think are really are critically important to us. You know, separately from that, I think it's worth spending a couple moments just on blockchain technology itself. And to go back to your initial question, like, why did I get into this space? Well, there were kind of the immediate reasons professionally why I thought the data security was important. But personally, you know, you can't help but if you live in America, for one thing, you can't, or in the world, I would say, you can't help but observe inequity in every aspect of our institutions. It's just a built-in reality. And part of what draws me to blockchain is the opportunity to dismantle some of that. And I think it really is that dramatic of a word that needs to be used. You know, it really is about looking at these systems that are failing so many people and thinking about how we can do better. And in my mind, there's no question that this technology is and is going to be a critical component to a rebuild or a reset in society that's going to make a better society.
So I think you raise a critical point where I think a lot of people who don't, who just look at blockchain on the surface, they don't get. There's actually, we're talking about paradigm shifts. We're talking about changing processes, underlying, it's not just the plumbing of the technology we're talking about here. We're actually talking about fundamental rebuild of the way we look at certain processes and certain institutions and how they work with others. And I think once people understand there's a culture element and as well as a mindset shift element, as well as the tech, that's the exciting piece about blockchain. I completely agree with you that, you know, people tend to be scared of the word disruption. I understand why, because sometimes, you know, it gets mixed in with rather radical thinking. But when you think about how, as a leader of, you know, the blockchain initiatives going on, talk a little bit about also the Presidio principles and how that comes about and how that helps others to really kind of coalesce around some of these concepts and actually build and behave in a way that we all collectively talk about a lot, but sometimes you need it down on paper, right?
Couldn't agree more. So we actually created a blockchain council last year at our global technology, along lines of global technology governance, to kind of think about governance in the blockchain space and what that might mean. And so this group was comprised of various leaders, like everyone from, you know, Bitcoin maximalists to people who are more skeptical about the technology or do kind of think it has a much narrower application and potential. But one thing that we all agreed on in our initial meeting last year, last spring, was, you know, this can be done better or it can be done worse. It can be done thoughtfully, or it can be done, you know, kind of just rebuilding the exact systems that we have now and kind of putting them, making them digital. And that, to all of us, was like the nightmare scenario, was that we would take exactly what's embedded in society and create those power structures yet again on a blockchain infrastructure, which is like, no,
right.
That's exactly not right. So what do we do about that? So the Presidio principles, which launched last week, are really fundamentally about embedding a user-centric approach into the application layer. So we said, look, these decentralized protocols, you know, blockchain protocols, they have certain fundamental realities around them, but it is absolutely the case that you can build on top of that. You can almost blockchain wash, if you will, right? You can kind of build something on top of a blockchain that's highly centralized, that replicates system dynamics, that in no way really changes anything about the systems and how they work, and call that, you know, blockchain backed. And we were like, that's not cool. You know, so what would be a way of trying to ensure that if that does happen, at least it can be kind of noted and called out, because there might be reasons why you have to do that and why that makes sense. I don't mean to say that anyone doing that is like a villain, right? But there needs to be an awareness of that's happening. So our principles, the Presidio principles, are designed to focus on an aspirational view. And we're saying, if we were actually taking this kind of disruption seriously, if we were saying this technology has the potential to really radically transform systems, you know, what might that look like in the design process? And here are some ideas, here are some things you can kind of check against to make sure that you're not inadvertently or deliberately, you know, going against that kind of opportunity. So that's what they're focused on. And we're really excited about it. The uptake's been great. And we've been pleased to see that various institutions are issuing guidance documents to their communities to say specifically, like, what does this mean for Ethereum developers? What does it mean for Hyperledger? You know, what does it mean for these various, what does it mean for certain funded portfolio companies by certain VCs? You know, they're taking the mantle here to say, we get that these are aspirational. We get that it's almost impossible at time zero, which is now, to kind of adhere to all of them. But we sure ought to be trying to do that. And we ought to be making critically aware that when something is not, you know, in this orientation, that we're able to adjust and pivot to get it back on track.
Absolutely. And I know, and I respect that we've got a lot of questions coming in, but I'm going to ask you a couple more before we go to Q&A, just because I want to cover a couple topics that we think are pretty important from a decentralization perspective. And we think about the world, ergo the World Economic Forum. We think about the world, you know, the democratization of the opportunity set that emerging tech can offer, including blockchain, is important. So when we think about a decentralized world, what message do you have for those entrepreneurs or students or people who are sitting in Colombia or sitting in Rwanda or, you know, any other country, let's say outside of the US?
Yeah.
what is the opportunity? What does this decentralization, what does it mean, and why should people be inspired, and why should they look into it if they haven't already, from your perspective?
It's a great question. So I think to take the lens that you asked me, I've always been of the mind that there is more traction and more possibility in the immediate short term and medium term in emerging economies that could potentially, and I hate this word, but could potentially almost leapfrog other systems. And part of the reason for that, I think, is the problems in those societies, they don't have the same, well, I'm speaking very broadly and generically here, but in many cases, there are places in the world that don't have the same bias towards institutions. And so when we talk about erosion of public trust, you know, it's kind of funny. I talk to people in other parts of the world and they're like, what public trust? We never trusted our government. We always thought everyone was corrupt. You know, like you're not kind of judging us against that. Now, it's not to say that I don't think of the erosion of public trust in democratic, you know, countries as deeply problematic. I do. And I do think that this technology is going to help us address those issues, but it's a much longer lead time because you're kind of battling a lot of inertia, and you have an existing power structure that is truly deeply powerful on the world stage. So I think that to people in some of the countries that you mentioned and others, you know, I think that the time is right. The time is now. You know, there is a lot of appetite for this kind of activity and for demonstrations that this kind of technology, this technology specifically, can actually lead to the creation of new microeconomies, of new systems of accountability. You know, we have a project going in Colombia where we basically are looking at a blockchain-backed system that is going to address corruption in public procurement. And just surfacing some of the issues that can happen there can lead to more accountability. You know, transparency, when embedded within the right ecosystem, the right policy framework, can actually lead to more accountability. And when you have a system that is kind of looking for an opportunity to shine light on some of these problems, I think you have a tremendous amount of potential to do a lot of good.
Yeah, absolutely agree. It's fantastic. Let's talk about money, the future of money. What is money? What's value when we start digitizing everything? Well, you know, WEF in the blockchain group in particular have been really focusing a lot on central bank digital currency. Talk to us a little bit about some of your initiatives, some of your thoughts.
Yeah, so, you know, we started about 2 years ago. We actually met with a small group of central bank technologists. And, you know, these are people that were kind of like, they were hyper aware of blockchain technology and its potential. They didn't really understand it. They wanted to learn more.
Right.
They were paying attention to some of the public pilots. You know, so we created this global group of about 40 plus different central banks that were, and the World Bank and some others, you know, that were looking to learn. And we said, look, we're not here to shill anything. We have no skin in the game. We just want to make sure you're getting accurate information. So we connected them kind of deep in the layers of different companies to say, you're not going to talk to the marketing person. No offense to those people. I love many of them. You're going to talk to the technical person, like the deep technical person. You're going to talk to the person who actually invented XYZ, you know, thing. And we were able to build a lot of trust in that community. And so at their initiative, they said to us, look, we see a lot of value in CBDC, central bank digital currency, and we want to help kind of making the case to the policy side of the house, who we were not talking to. The forum talks to them a lot, but we were not talking to those people for this project.
Right.
So at their request, we pulled together a policymakers toolkit that we launched in Davos, designed to say, what are the considerations here? And I think it's important to note that in no way did we say a blockchain is necessary for a CBDC to be launched. We think there are cases where it does add value and cases where it does not add value and cases almost where it probably should be avoided. But we tried to articulate what are the considerations, what do you have to put together, who should be in the room, all this kind of stuff. So we launched that. And then it was always a plan in my mind, you know, how do we make people understand that crypto is not only coming, it's here and it's really coming. And so I kind of had a 5-year plan for this when I started here at the forum. And so this was kind of phase 1, was to say, okay, CBDC, relatively unthreatening, you know, still part of the existing financial system, very important, a lot of opportunities. If we had them, God knows we would have had different responses to COVID, for example, potentially stimulus payments. Anyhow, so our next piece of work is something called the Digital Currency Governance Consortium. And that is focusing on digital currency and stablecoin. Beyond CBDC, although that's part of the work, but we're saying, look, we're looking at extrinsically backed assets. It's not yet crypto, to be very clear. We're looking at extrinsically backed, you know, coin, and we're saying we're neutral as to what that would look like. Is it fiat backed? Is it asset backed? Whatever, right? But there's something there. What would be a robust governance system that would underlie that really would address issues of financial inclusion, that would truly be supranational in its orientation? Is it even possible to do that and to meet kind of some of the regulatory requirements around that are kind of killing some of these initiatives, et cetera, right? So we're breaking the work into 4 pillars. We're looking deeply at the regulatory space, tech and infrastructure, including wallets, et cetera, hardware. We're looking at emerging economies specifically as a particular bucket to say what are the needs and how do they deviate from other needs in the space in those economies, both in the positive and negative ways. And then use cases specifically, looking at a bunch of different use cases to kind of say, you know, where are the friction points among these different categories, and how can we how can we even, and if so, how can we reconcile these? And this is all by way of saying that ultimately, you know, we're going to be able to normalize the discussion of crypto and make people understand, particularly some of the people that we deal with, our constituents at the forum, you know, this isn't scary, actually. It doesn't need to be scary. There are things that need to change. We're seeing the results of the system. We're seeing the results every day of systems we put into place that don't work. So maybe it's time for us to embrace some of these alternatives and do that wholeheartedly and with an open mind, and really get to a place where we can benefit from our society can really benefit from some of the opportunities that these different forms of money can present.
I completely agree with you, having come from the banking sector and market infrastructure, where 5 years ago, if you even uttered the word Bitcoin or cryptocurrency in most circles, they would just tell you to get out.
Yeah.
What are you talking about? It is now much more sober discussion. We're not there yet, but for those who've been hard at work over the last few years, things have moved. Conversation has moved. And I think everyone in the community who might feel, you know, challenged on certain days, there is progress. And I think I absolutely agree with you. It's accelerating. So with that, I am going to go to some of the Q&A because we've got quite a few questions here. Really appreciate all those in the audience who are asking questions. We'll do our best to cover as many as we can. We're going to backtrack a little bit because you mentioned future of work, and there's a question that came in almost immediately, I think, when you mentioned it. There's a question here regarding future of work as an initiative of the International Labor Organization. Do you work with the ILO, and how's Blockchain fit in?
Yeah, so we do work with the ILO. We work specifically with a number of different, both the ILO and also member institutions out of our Future of Work initiative, which is headquartered in Geneva. So there's a whole body of work that's running there, led by that team. How does blockchain fit into it? Great question. So we have not yet launched a specific blockchain project focused on the future of work. What we're looking at instead are broader economic models. So through tokenization models, for example, through what I mentioned, this kind of idea, right, that you could create a more equitable allocation of the reward across an entire production chain, this kind of thing. Tip the farmer types of models, things like that. So they aren't necessarily just focused on the future of work. Future of work is a core contributor, I would say, to that work, and a core beneficiary of that work as well.
Right. And thank Richard for that question. And then the next one goes to Michael. By the way, speaking of tokenization, Michael is a regular of ours. And Michael, if you're listening, I would love to tip you a token for always participating. And that is something I hope one day we could have a circular economy that allows us to do that. But Michael's question to you, Sheila, is blockchain for social good is more than just a phrase, which I completely agree, or more than just a phase. What measures can WEF use to gauge its success or challenges? Do we have metrics yet on what we would deem as success?
Such a great question. Yeah, this is something we talk about all the time internally, right? So I think a lot of the measures of success, our uptake, our kind of change, we have a lot softer metric. A lot of this is like, how are we shaping the conversation? Because part of what the forum's role, I really see as my role and the forum's role, is helping introduce ideas into the discourse, right? At these levels of power, to be perfectly blunt. So to me, it's, how much appetite is there for these conversations? What does attendance look like in Davos sessions to talk about these topics? What is the appetite we're getting from our partners to participate in these topics? Like things like that, there actually are hard number metrics to that. We can actually look and see like what projects are drawing the most attention and where is the kind of weight of the attention going, right? And the commitment that these institutions, both companies, government, civil society, whatever, academics are willing to make. So to us, those are some of the hard metrics that we measure. I think it's a broader question though about how do we as a blockchain ecosystem measure success in the social impact space, and that is a question that many people are wrestling with on a near daily basis. What does success look like? And I think more to the point for me, it's how do we avoid redundant, duplicative work. It's something Sandra and I talk about all the time. Like the last thing anybody wants to do is be not amplifying a successful project and instead like launching something that's the same thing. That just doesn't make any sense unless that's done deliberately and in tandem to prove a model, right? That can be very beneficial. So part of what we look at is when we launch something, we see what's the scaling uptake. Are our affiliate center country governments interested in that? You know, so like this thing we're doing in Colombia, for example, tons of interest from our other affiliates on rooting out corruption and exploring what this might look like. We created an RFP focused on having transparency metrics embedded into it. So you actually have, you know, QA built into your technical specs that basically say like these policy levers need to be focused on. So I think that things like that are how we measure success as well. But this is a conversation that's ongoing, and I'm trying to track it as closely as I can in other institutions to see what our colleagues at other institutions are doing as well. Great question.
Completely agree with you. And I think we need to get to that next level, as you say, where we have successful pilots or projects and get rolled out to other jurisdictions in a more lightweight, rapid fire way, adjusting for locality, you know, local issues and local determinants, but we do need to get better at it. So appreciate that you guys are doing some of that work as well.
We're trying. It's one of the hardest things. Yeah.
Absolutely. But to me, that is success when we can start replicating and seeing those use cases move across countries and jurisdictions. Let us go here to this one. Let's talk a little bit about supply chain. You mentioned global supply chain and the toolkit that you guys launched weeks ago. How can blockchain benefit in the manufacturing sector? So let's talk about manufacturing in the context of global supply chain, and then further in the context of COVID.
Yeah. So, I mean, I look at ways, you know. So I would encourage you all to take a look at our supply chain toolkit. It's very practical. It's designed, part of what we say, you know, always, and Sandra's quoted me on this, you know, blockchain's a team sport. So it kind of helps you think about what players need to be part of your ecosystem, part of the conversation, how do you engage them? How do you create a consortium? How do you even paper that? What kind of NDA do you need? All these different kinds of questions that come up, right? We think about tax and audit issues. We think about cybersecurity. We think about a lot of these different topics. And so it's broken up into different modules. And what we recommend is that people kind of come through the intro and then kind of really wrestle with these questions internally. So we have a very built out, very robust, I should say, advanced manufacturing production platform within the forum, again, headquartered out of Geneva, that we worked very closely with on this, and a very robust supply chain, you know, companies that come to us for general guidance on how to think about these things. So this initiative represented the input of over 100 companies, 40 countries, 40 use cases, 20 countries. You know, we piloted it in 5 different jurisdictions. It's ongoing being used and scaled across the world. And I think there's tremendous potential here to think about, I mean, you can just imagine, like right now we're so margin based. And so what would it look like if you actually could quite agilely and flexibly track things, right, in a way that was able, could actually create increased access to a ledger that would actually reliably and in a trustworthy manner demonstrate where things are at any given moment and how you could actually make shifts and changes. And you can imagine that information alone in real time could provide tremendous value. So, you know, again, we launched this during the pandemic, which was entirely coincidental. But I think that the immediate implications were very clear. Everything from how do you ensure that masks are being, you know, developed, or respirators actually are up to code and standard and can be used by hospitals versus others. You know, how do you track varying supplies that have gotten lost or diverted? We know this has happened in many cases, including within the United States. How do you kind of how do you address the kind of very unhealthy competition that arose, you know, by states here and again by various countries? All these kinds of questions could be addressed if you had a blockchain underlying your system.
I want to thank Anurag for that question. And then there's, this is a different question, but it's got, you've answered some elements of it by discussing global supply chains and how we can make them better. Any thought, this is from Jan, any thoughts on how to address the technical, educational, and resource divide that we've got to make blockchain and our economic structure more inclusive? So again, we talked about global supply chain, but there's many areas where there are inequities you've mentioned. What are some of the, let's talk about specific use cases that you think are areas where we could actually help and blockchain could actually help. Government comes to mind immediately.
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, I think that what I would say to that first is an example of how we addressed this issue. So one thing that we did in Colombia, I talked about this example, we actually used an all local team to build a prototype. And so we connected them with global players who were deep experts that could provide guidance, mentoring, support around some of this, that could do some really robust QA, on this smart contract piece specifically. We're really grateful to QuantStamp for that, for example, and others. But our idea was, you don't parachute. One of the big problems is kind of this colonialist approach to things, which is like very easy to fall into, where you kind of parachute a team in, you do some work, and then you like bail out, and like there's no one left there to maintain the technology. And to us, that was the opposite of what should happen. So we made sure to really support the local Colombian ecosystem, which was flourishing, by the way, well before we got there. There were tons of people, and Colombia is a very active country in blockchain. It has been for many years, for those who don't know. But we made sure to basically empower them with resources and to build a community, connect them into others who were deep experts, and make that community very strong so that it's going to last well beyond when we basically exit. The other thing that we do, and this comes back from my kind of community organizing, some of the work that I've done in my past, is when we went in, when we did our problem assessment, we really created a very diverse community of voices to ensure that we were actually addressing a real problem, and that problem there would actually be a use for blockchain. And in some cases, we found that blockchain was helpful. In some cases, it was actually really not helpful at all. So, and we tried to surface all of that, and the report that's coming out will basically surface all of that and what we found. But we brought in, so we focused on specifically this provision of food services to schools. That was an area ripe with corruption. There were a lot of articles and investigative journalism that happened around that before we got there last December, so 2 Decembers ago. And right. We ran a workshop initially with students and teachers and parents and, PTA and the mayor and like all these different bodies, the local chamber of commerce, in this region, to say, what are you seeing? What are the issues? What's actually going on here? And as always, when you approach it that way, you learn, because there are people who are way better situated than any of us to understand what that was. And then we can kind of help solution. But because they were bought into it, and because we were really focused on enriching the ecosystem within the country and within actually the district, that's something I think that everyone could do a much better job of across the board.
That's fantastic. And so when we think about, the importance of that, you hired local, you're trying to nurture a local ecosystem, and that's fantastic. We're also up against, this leads us to the next question here from Stan about patents. And yesterday, Amazon, there's some articles around Amazon's patent on blockchain to authenticate materials in their supply chain, end to end, which sounds great. I mean, if we're able to track and trace from end to end, that's not a bad thing. But for big corporates to then overlay patents around these types of processes, how do you see that? How do we marry that with trying to democratize the opportunity set for those out there? It's a tough one.
It is a very tough one. And I think that it's a fair question to ask me specifically, being that I work at the forum and we talk to a lot of these companies all the time. Although I should note that I haven't actually spoken to Amazon since yesterday. So like, just be very clear about that. I'm speaking only for myself. Yeah, I think this is sort of the question. And so part of what we do is, and you recall, like our entire orientation, we were really on brand because we're a Swiss organization and we are objective and neutral. It's very important to us to kind of maintain that neutrality. And part of the reason we have credibility with a lot of different players in the global ecosystem is because of that, because we are deliberately objective and neutral. So it's really not for us to say, this is bad, that's bad, et cetera. It's for us to say, how do we encourage a thriving ecosystem? How do we avoid kind of over market dominance? And so I think the good thing about blockchain is this happens kind of naturally. So if you recall, even 3 to 5 years ago, there were a lot of early experiments at big companies trying to kind of own the landscape. And this is where I kind of started saying blockchain's a team sport. It's not going to work. It's just simply not going to work. You're going to wind up with a system that's beneficial to maybe your immediate suppliers or your immediate production chain and your supply chain, but it's not going to scale because no one's going to use it. And that's not the nature of how this technology works. So to some extent, I feel like, we're protected a little bit in this space by the nature of the technology and the nature of what is more easily able to scale and what is not. There's also just the inherent competition that one company's solution is not likely to be, they're not likely to become a vendor necessarily to, others. Now, I think we've seen examples of this not happening. And you look at like kind of some of the backend infrastructure and how there are companies that dominate that marketplace, even to competitor companies. So I don't mean to be naive about this, but I do think because there are so many experiments happening in this space, particularly ones that are more geographically or culturally relevant. And like I noted, I really think that we're going to see this emergence from economies that are not on the world radar right now, that are dominating the space simply because they have opportunities that don't present themselves to those who are thinking in a traditional, kind of way, a traditional sort of shareholder capitalist kind of way.
Yeah.
So the forum is gently, like I said, we have this whole movement around stakeholder capitalism. We've had companies, sign on to kind of thinking about these models, and we're providing them roadmaps on how to do this. So I think that we're seeing this happen slowly. So any one of these things doesn't particularly alarm me, and I think we're going to see a lot more of this attention being paid. And in my mind, it draws more attention to the validity of this space. Like this kind of activity really proves that there is something here to pay close attention to. And so for any of those who are remaining skeptics, and I speak specifically of governments in this case, it really helps make the case that you're really behind at this point if you're not paying close attention.
That's a great point. And I'm going to modify Jim's question just a little bit here, but building on top of what you've just said, let's talk about global financial institutions. Let's narrow the scope a little bit. FIs, are dealing with a number of different challenges. They were already fintechs, challenging number of different business areas, overlay emerging tech and blockchain as well. What do you see from a global landscape point of view? How are the financial institutions kind of evolving? And do you see them adopting a decentralization model? Do you feel like they're kind of just still figuring things out? And do you see that there are transparency areas where there has been improved transparency or increased data sharing? And there's a lot of different examples we could look at, but what do you see?
I think that incumbents are, I can confirm, if this isn't already obvious, incumbents are paying a tremendous amount of attention to this space of attention, right? So there's already been a lot of movement in digital payments, as I think we all are aware, in terms of how a lot of these institutions, are payment providers, banks, whatever, are really thinking about digital payments. And that is moving over into digital currency. We are seeing a lot of interest in engaging with digital currencies, whatever they might be, whatever form they take, first kind of CBDC orientation, but also just kind of thinking about wallets and hardware and how you might actually engage with this. And I think that the reality is that there's going to be more and more consumer demand for this. It's going to be driven by almost I don't want to call it grassroots necessarily, because you have to have access to these institutions in the first place. But to the extent that there is a little more of that happening, and you're going to see a lot of increased openness to this. So, unfortunately, I can't see the question specifically. So I think that if the question is kind of how are FIs globally thinking about, are they thinking about this? And yes, categorically, yes, 100%. They all are, absolutely, no question about it. How are they thinking about this? I think we're actually seeing a lot more openness to working together. Now, again, that isn't quite the same thing. It's far from saying we're really going to open up our entire systems and engage with, consumers and engage with retail, all these different kinds of things. But there's certainly more of an openness to understanding that they aren't going to really succeed if they go it alone, and to thinking about how they might actually come together to create a system that is more transparent and robust. And I will say that I do think the Libra Association propelled and catapulted that work forward. And I think that we would be remiss if we didn't kind of acknowledge that reality. It was happening quietly in the background. And that exercise really just showed a spotlight on the fact that there was a willingness to come together and think about this. Now, to the broader point about, is that actually going to result in any changes and shifting in the power dynamics, et cetera, that is a very fair point, right? Like, are we just, instead of kind of moving all the way to kind of the promise of crypto and this kind of new engagement with money and this peer-to-peer engagement, are we instead just kind of like taking all these institutions and now, great, now they're all working together to kind of like, create their, embed their systems, right? Look, I'm not here to tell you, I'm not going to say with a straight face that that's probably not the orientation, having not been in those conversations myself specifically, but I do think that there's promise there. And I do think that part of what we need to see is, again, movements by various protocol that have nothing to do with any of those institutions as well, that are kind of proving this model, and they're quietly coming up, from behind, if you will, and they're particularly focusing on economies where the banking system is less relevant. This gets back to my point about some of the emerging economies, where you can kind of create and prove that this really can work in places that are not fighting the inertia of these institutions already.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to take Charles's question and modify.
Just one more point on that, Sandra, really quickly. And I think it's, people, particularly at this time we're in right now, everybody wants to see revolution happen right away. And in certain parts of society, it should happen right away. There are certain institutions that just need to be completely overhauled in immediate short term. I personally don't think that money is one of those. I think that we need time. I think that it takes time to build a better system. It's very serious. It's not just about engendering peer-to-peer payment that we've already done. This is about the world economy. This is about a huge change in these systems that it needs to happen. There's no question about it. When people ask me, how do you feel about crypto? Are you bullish on it? I'm like, yeah, but my time horizon is a lot longer than many people are willing to. I think many people have the same time horizon I do, by the way. They're just not willing to say it publicly, because there's this sense that if something is so far out, is it even going to happen? Yes, it's going to take time. We're going to get there, but we need to kind of exercise responsibility in making sure that we're not just rebuilding a system that is equally challenging and just going to create new problems for a different group of people. We need to be very thoughtful about that. And so that's part of the reason why we're kind of going, or I'm kind of taking the team and working in this systematic way to start, CBDCs, digital currencies, looking at crypto, really exploring the foundational issues here, Presidio principles, trying to think about how do we embed these qualities, these values of compassion, frankly, of thinking equitably about these systems. How do we embed that in the build rather than just kind of hastily doing something, which isn't going to solve the problem?
Right. No, you raise an excellent point there. And I think there's always sometimes a rush to build, but you do hit a wall when you do have to think about consequences and time. And it's oftentimes much more complicated, and as they say, devil in the details.
Exactly.
We're largely, many economists will use different terms, whether we're in a recession, we're heading into a recession or depression. We're going to push that aside for a second, but let's just say the global economic outlook is not looking good right now.
Correct.
We've got Charles here who asked whether you think blockchain could help at all managing the enormous thing that is world debt. Do we actually think that blockchain could help manage that? That's an interesting question. I think multifaceted. What are your thoughts around it? I think there are improvements that can definitely be made around the tracking and tracing of debt issuance, and
Agreed.
the whole process is very arcane.
Agreed. And I'm hesitant to say, I got to be honest with you. It's not like that's not already well accounted for. Everyone knows what they owe and what they don't owe. And I guess the question is how transparent do you need that to be? It's not like it's that hard to find that information right now. I think the question becomes more one of debt forgiveness and kind of what that might look like. But again, it's a little hard for me to be honest. I'm just sitting here right now and having thought about this for all of 30 seconds. It's a little hard to imagine how that would add a tremendous amount of value. Because again, I think these are things that are well documented and well known, and you have entire institutions that are the lenders, that are well aware, and believe me, anyone who's a debt holder is well aware of what they owe at any given time. So that one escapes me a bit, Sandra, but I take your point. It's certainly an arcane system, and so it's hard to imagine there could be some technological intervention that could be beneficial. Maybe it could, maybe the ability to kind of pay without an intermediary could eliminate fees or something like that. But I don't think of that friction as being the issue that we'd actually want to address in that particular space.
Agreed. This is, I think, coming from a lawyer. It's got to be. Kathleen Tyson, thank you for asking this question. She's done work with the Financial Markets Law Committee, and they've seen a lot of legislation and regulation around in the 1990s that takes 1990s regulation and applies them to blockchain. In your view, it seems to protect, some of it protects vested interests, and some of it's just a lack of understanding on the technology itself. in your view, who is actually leading the effort on first principles of appropriate supervision and legal principles? I'm trying to read the.
So I guess the question is, who is leading that work? Well, I will tell you, it's not us.
Yeah.
First of all, I think that, you know, some of this is happening. I mean, I think you do some of this work at GBC. There's some of this stuff happening, not quite exactly this. I think Chamber of Digital Commerce does some of this stuff. You know, they have work there. There was Accord doing work on kind of smart contracts and how they might actually engage with financial markets. I think there are a number of, you know, Open Law, I think, was looking at this stuff. So there's a number of, I think, different bodies that are thinking about this. It is not something that we are currently focusing on. We are looking in India at how we might harmonize smart contracts with the payment system there, and where that sort of contractual obligation might be codified and where that might actually be helpful. And looking to do a pilot with the Unified Payments Interface in India, but that's different. That's not what this question was about, I don't think. But those are the organizations I would say that off top of my mind, and you know, you probably know others as well, Sandra, that are thinking about that topic area generally.
We've got a lot of questions here. Let me just try to make sure I'm being equitable about who we're going out to. So there's a question here. There's a lot of questions here, actually. I'm going to lump them, a bunch of them together. There are a lot of questions around decentralization and the adoption towards a decentralized future. Let's talk a little bit. There's some questions around how do NGOs look at it versus how do companies look at it? Are they adopting it? Can you just kind of, you know, lay out for us, where do you see decentralization actually ending up in a real world scenario? Because the ones who are purists would like to see everything decentralized so that there is no CEO, there is no head of anything. It just governs, right? In a very DAO-like situation. Where do we end up, do you think? Or where are we moving towards? What do you see?
Yeah, great question. So I think, first of all, I mean, I think we're tracking DAO oriented, you know, activity very closely. It's something we pay a lot of attention to. I think that, let me just answer it this way. I think I'll just take this angle on it. I think that I certainly see corporate governance being deeply affected by this space and by the principles of decentralization. I do think that we're going to see, in line with this stakeholder capitalism movement that I'm talking about, that's getting, I mean, it's getting a tremendous amount of traction from major institutions.
Right.
I think there's already discussion about how would you actually regulate in a manner that would benefit, you know, those who are taking a stakeholder approach. Could there be tax implications for doing so? Could there be, you know, whatever it might be, right? Like, I think there's a lot of ways of thinking about that, both from the kind of standpoint of citizen engagement individuals, but also, you know, countries and governments, et cetera. I think repatriation of taxes is a giant issue that it's come up again and again and again. There are initiatives that have been launched recently by, you know, the multi-stakeholder manner that we are, again, you know, supportive of. We're not officially involved with them, but we're supportive of them, very supportive of them. So I think there's things like that happening. So I do think it is inevitable that corporate governance specifically is going to learn lessons from decentralization and what could happen if you actually open up your model. And we've already seen some of this stuff happen, right? With the way you think about different shares, the way you think about, you know, what it means to have a class A or class B, like privilege, all preferred shares, all this, there's already kind of embedded in our corporate governance models around in a shareholder world, you know, this idea that you could be more broadly engaging of those who are minority shareholders, even if they're like tiny, you know, minuscule minority, like, you know, ant-like, you know, shareholders almost, right? Right. So there is some understanding that that's important, and part of it is that it's really hard to do within the existing system, the way that it's set up, the way you're regulated, the way, you know, it's just really hard to do. Not to mention, like, where you're kind of, where the weight of what you need to kind of show on your investor calls and all that kind of turns up. But I do think there, again, and I, you know, I'm not at liberty yet to name them, but we will probably be naming them in the next quarter, major companies that are actively exploring this space. And not that they're like looking at the DAO necessarily, because that's a very, you know, radical transformation. And it's kind of, I think, where things are going to learn from without getting all the way there necessarily. But I think they are really exploring what would it mean to just be more equitable about some of these things, to provide more stakeholder voice, you know, at various points along the way around certain decisions. So I think you're seeing the creation of certain boards, independent oversight boards that are being created, which are, again, that's a kind of more of a top-down thing, but it's sort of a step in the direction to say, we need more input. We need more independent input. Like, we need to see this happening. So that's the area I would anchor on, I think, is corporate governance and how we think about that in our society.
Great. And apologize if it's George or Jorge, asking about GDPR and some of the hurdles and some of the roadblocks that people find related to GDPR and blockchain adoption. Do you have any thoughts, as you also look after data policy?
I do, yeah, I do. I run our data policy division as well.
What are your thoughts around the California bill, as well as
well, there's the thing coming up in Brazil, the new regulation down there. Rwanda is about to issue one that we advised on, and we helped them think through. So let me answer this a different way. So part of what we're rolling out something we're calling the Data for Common Purpose Initiative, and this is basically saying, look, data protection is really important, privacy is really important, all these things really matter. The way around GDPR, I mean, it's kind of like this kitschy, kind of, overly cute kind of phrase, but like, I mean, you just don't collect that data. Like, that data does not go on blockchain, right? Like, I mean, that's kind of the answer, right? So there are many people are already kind of working in this space with the limitation that GDPR provides, and they're finding ways to kind of, do an end run around it through that manner. And in many cases, that is the right answer. In some cases, it doesn't work for obvious reasons, right? But where you can collect less data, yes, collect less data. I mean, always, obviously, right? That just seems like a no-brainer to me. But what we're thinking about is, look, I mean, we have the capacity now and capability with new technologies, including smart contracts and blockchains, to basically permission data differently. And so I personally might, let's take my genomic data. I might feel very differently about the permissioning I'm willing to grant the use of that data for something like creating a vaccine for, COVID-19 versus, a cosmetic company. I mean, I don't want to call anybody out, but the cosmetics company that might want to create a product that, exactly matches my hair type or color, right? I mean, that might be very important to me personally, but I'm not willing to share my genomic data, to do that.
Right.
It's the same data. So the idea that we're kind of saying X data is always off limits for what, it should be considered very carefully. It should always be anonymized. It should be aggregated, whatever. But the idea that access to that data is completely cut off always, and it could have tremendous social benefit, doesn't make sense and is not in line with what people actually want.
Right.
So part of what we're trying to say is, rather than creating increasingly fragmented data protection policies and orienting around protectionism, which basically means that like you're going to create these siloed businesses that can't operate globally, which we think is deeply problematic for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is the access it provides to workforce, to labor, to different cultural norms around doing this, all this kind of stuff. It's like a huge problem. Instead of doing that, you could actually think about a freer flow of data that had specific bounds around it, and that was created through regulation that took as a starting place the idea that most data, the data ownership resides with the creator of that data. The owner of that data is the person who generates that data, right? I mean, like that's your starting place, and we think that's exactly right, and that's kind of where GDPR and CCPA start. But you could actually imagine that it's the use or the purpose that's actually being used for that governs the permissioning around it and governs how you would treat it. And if you start there, you can have much more interesting conversations that really are about societal benefit, much more than just knee-jerk notions of protectionism that are not actually protecting many people, because again, people are just doing an end run around that and finding new and creative ways. And so all you're doing is you're putting more and more and more data behind the wall, and then you're not enabling, the unlocking of that for purposes that can be useful. And I think about this as an example, and then I'll stop on this. I know a lot of other questions, but health data, there's no question that as a woman of color in the United States, when I go in to the doctor and I'm recommended medication, that the studies were all on white men. That's not me, right? I would happily provide, and I think it's important that we have access to data on different populations, particularly in the healthcare space, to create medicine that is actually going to work for the world's population, not just, white men, right? Of a certain age, by the way. It doesn't work. So I worry that if we focus strictly on protectionism, we're losing opportunities to actually create, services and products that are designed to be much more inclusive. And that, to me, you have to balance those things.
I absolutely agree with you. And I would argue that right now our data protection laws are crafted like blunt tools and not very smart.
That's
so
right. They're not nuanced.
To kind of work on that with the legislators. Samantha has an interesting question here, and you alluded to work with our collaboration with the WHO. Are there specific funding resources at WEF for blockchain-enabled COVID response initiatives, or are there any projects that you can talk about?
Yeah, are there funding resources? So we are not currently channeling any funding toward, we're not a funder, just to be clear. So we don't ourselves fund anything. We're not a grant making institution. What we did in our COVID-19 action platform was help businesses, specifically businesses, it was very oriented at that community versus governments, but really help businesses uh, collectively act, right? And so kind of think about where might their funding actually flow, what would be most useful, this kind of thing, and sort of create that collaborative mechanism. To my knowledge, nothing that was funded from that group was blockchain oriented, but I confess I don't know. It's quite possible there was some blockchain work that was funded. It's led by a different team. And so I can certainly, it's actually an interesting question. I will look into that and see, but not to my knowledge, no. In terms of projects that we're orienting around COVID-19 or pandemic response, our supply chain toolkit is very much turned into exactly that. And I think going forward, we are looking really more at the recovery period that will come post-pandemic and orienting our projects around that. Most of our projects are much longer term, they're foundational works. They're much longer term orientation. We don't have like a quick 3-month turnaround on things with that. Because of the nature of where the technology is. In the data space, we are doing some more rapid response type of activities and interventions.
Fantastic. Yeah. And shifting gears a little bit, but it touches upon a lot of the topics that we've already talked about. But one of the audience members would like to know your thoughts on self-sovereign identity. And is WEF doing any work around that too?
I mean, yeah, digital identity is the enabler of all of these things. So I run 2 teams here, blockchain and data policy. What do they have in common? I mean, a lot of things. They have a lot of things in common, but one of the major things they have in common is they need digital identity in order to scale. There is no question about it. And I've said this in many fora. Like, I think that until we basically come to a consensus, a global consensus understanding on what digital identity should look like, and SSID is obviously a core component of that, we're really hampered in our ability to move in these spaces. I mean, and I think everyone agrees with that. Like, anyone paying any attention agrees with that 100%. Like, once that layer is kind of in your tech stack, as it were, I mean, things just blow up. And we're really moving towards that world fast. Like, if there's an acceleration I've seen, I'm sure you've seen this too, there's an acceleration I've seen is in that space. It is in the multiplicity of interventions that are being explored and kind of thinking about what does it look like, embedded in hardware, embedded in wallets, embedded in cards, embedded in, whatever it might be, right? Tons of that in AR and VR devices, like all this stuff is really, really happening and happening quickly. So I guess I don't know the exact question, but the answer is yes, 1,000 times yes. It is so critically important. We pay a ton of attention to it. Once we're there, you're just going to see terminal velocity, basically escape velocity on these technologies.
I completely agree with you. It's the gateway to so many different things being unlocked. And we're heading there. We're getting there.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. We've actually blown through almost an hour already, Sheila.
Wow.
There are a lot more.
Not surprised.
But I'm going to give you the floor for 1 minute and just say, what are your thoughts? We're going to focus on the U.S. We have a lot of heavy hearts here. It's been very difficult. I'm sitting in New York. You're in San Francisco. We've got teams in D.C. and all over the U.S. It's not great. Do you just have any parting thoughts for the audience on, any words you may have?
Yeah. I spent the weekend, I do a lot of activism, in my non, I consider it professional as well. And I spent the weekend really helping, organize basically witnesses to various protests, to document and this kind of thing. I am a lawyer by training, so I do keep a foot in that world, and I'm on a couple of boards that support some of this work as well. I have 3 daughters. It's something that we talk a lot about anti-racism work in our lives. We talk a lot about how we can support communities that are marginalized. I always tell them, it's important to use our voices to give voice to the voiceless. That's kind of like, what's the point of any of this if we're not actually surfacing communities that for whatever reason don't have access to the same microphone and are to some extent shouting into the void or feel that way, whether they are or not. And so I would just encourage everyone to take advantage of this time, if you haven't already been doing this in your life, to really think about amplifying the voices of marginalized people. And that might look different in your community, wherever you might be in the world. but there are some people who are not a part of the conversation equally and equitably and in that manner. And I think I got into blockchain, again, through the lens of empowerment and thinking about how we could enable more democracy in systems, how we could change institutions to make them more accountable, but also to make them more equitable, like really to think about how we might embed principles of liquid democracy within technology. And so I think it's an opportunity for everyone in this space to stop, think about who's not in the room, examine your own internal biases, what you're bringing, what baggage you're bringing to the table, what voices you systematically are excluding, and do better. All of us can do better. And if we kind of really collectively focus on doing better in these areas, it's going to have an impact.
Well, thank you. It's been the fastest 60 minutes I've spent in a while. Appreciate it. And be safe, everyone. Be well. And I'm going to hand back over to Sophia as we conclude. Thank you, Sheila.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Sheila. Just to close us out, I'll just say that a recording of this will be sent to all of you along with a link to the Presidio principles so you can check them out. We also encourage you to join us next Tuesday for another episode of the Global Leaders series with Martin Batlam, International Group Head of Finance and Projects and FinTech Global Co-Chair at DLA Piper. We also have a great conversation coming up this Thursday evening at 6 p.m. with Everledger founder and CEO Leanne Camp on blockchain, circular economies, and sustainability. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. We will send those registration links, a link to the Presidio principles, and of course, recording of this wonderful webinar. Thanks so much, Sheila. Thanks so much, Sandra, and goodbye to everyone.
Bye.
Bye.